Hello again, class. Today we're going to talk about our last lesson in the age of Jackson, or at least the last in this series of lessons specifically related to Andrew Jackson's presidency. And today, I believe I promised this on our previous lesson, today we're going to talk about the National Bank. Now, I know it's been a couple lessons since we talked about it, so let's talk about it again. So, unlike some of his predecessors, including Democrat Republican James Monroe, Jackson really disliked the second bank. All right, so in this way, Jackson's much more similar to Jefferson. Now, this is why we sometimes compare Jacksonian democracy to Jeffersonian democracy, because they did have some similarities between them, and their dislike of the banks was a big similarity. So why? Just personally, and like a lot of farmers of the time period, Jackson distrusted banks. They had a habit of just going out of business, and everyone who had their money in the bank would simply lose their money. There wasn't any regulation or protection for that sort of thing in the early 19th century, so a lot of people distrusted banks, including Andrew Jackson. Jackson thought the bank favored wealthy people and hurt common people. Now, this is a charge or an allegation you hear people make today as well. All right, so in that respect, some people's attitudes about banks today isn't all that different than how people thought about them, almost 200 years ago. And finally, Jackson thought the bank had too much power. And if we've seen something about Jackson, through his threat, the use of force over nullification, through his unilateral decision of not to enforce Supreme Court opinions, and other such matters, Jackson likes to be the one with the power, and he thought the bank had too much power. So, in 1832, the bank president, this guy I have a picture on the screen, Nicholas Biddle, is going to make a strategic error. All right, so let's back up and review. Remember, these national banks are given 20-year charters. All right, so it's basically official permission to stay in business for 20 years. And then at the end of that 20 years, Congress has to renew the charter, or the federal government has to renew the charter and give them another 20 years. Well, the National Bank, and this one, by the way, was the second one. The first one was created, when Hamilton and Jefferson were in Washington's cabinet. And then 20 years later, they created a second national bank around the time of the War of 1812. They created the second one. And that bank charter is due to expire in 1836. All right, so by 1836, either the bank's going to go out of business or the charter has to be renewed. Well, Nicholas Biddle got in his head that since Jackson was running for president in 1832, he wouldn't want to get into a big public fight about the bank. So Nicholas Biddle thought, well, hey, why don't I get the people in Congress, who generally supported the bank, to go ahead and renew its charter 4 years early. All right, so that way you go ahead and get this issue taken care of in 1832 instead of waiting until 1836. But let's think for a minute. Think about our lesson on checks and balances and how each of the branches of government is designed to keep the other branches from getting and receiving too much power, having too much power. Well, what is the power the president has to keep the executive branch from getting too far out of line? I'm sorry. Let me just stop this. Let me start this little thing all over again. So I apologize for that. Okay, so Biddle tells Congress to renew the bank 4 years early. Congress votes to do so. Now, let's talk about checks and balances. Checks and balances is one of the principles within the Constitution that's supposed to limit the power of government. And the way it works is each branch of government, so you have the three, judicial, executive, legislative, each branch of government is supposed to kind of keep an eye on the other branches of government and make sure they don't abuse their authority or start gaining too much power. And one of the things the executive branch can do to keep the legislative branch in check is to veto the laws or the bills that the legislative branch passes. Okay? So as we know, the legislative branch writes the laws, but to go into effect, in most instances, the president has to sign them. If the president doesn't want to sign them, the president does what's called a veto. All right, writes VETO on the bills. And this is exactly what Jackson did to the charter or to the renewal of the second bank charter. All right, he vetoed the bill. All right, and so Congress's bill couldn't go into effect. So this charter was not in fact renewed, which is what the bank and Nicholas Biddle was hoping for. Now, Henry Clay, all right, so we've talked about him a few times during this series of lectures. Henry Clay is once again running for president, and he accuses Jackson of being a tyrant. Right? So the idea is, well, you know, the majority of Congress wanted this bank to continue, and here you are, president, you're stopping it. But the fact is, the Constitution specifically gives the president the power to veto laws. And so in this sense, Jackson was, you know, participating or taking use of a power given to him by the Constitution. But Henry Clay apparently thought it would be good campaign strategy to accuse Jackson of using this veto power like a tyrant. Unfortunately for Henry Clay, though, the voters agreed with Jackson, and he won the election. All right, so the whole idea behind trying to renew the bank charter early was that picking a fight with the bank and using a veto would be unpopular with voters, and so surely Jackson wouldn't do it. But Jackson got the last laugh, because not only did he go ahead and pick this fight and veto the law during an election year, but it seems the voters agreed with him and his thoughts on the bank. But now this didn't mean the bank just disappeared, because remember, its original charter ran all the way to 1836, and we're way back in 1832. But Jackson didn't want to wait another 4 years to kill off the bank. So he's going to try to find a way to get rid of the bank sooner. So he orders government funds to be deposited in state banks. And his opponents call these, quote, pet banks. So this should remind you of the spoils system. Remember when Jackson got elected, he gave out government jobs to people who supported him. Well, now he's basically finding banks that support him or that he likes and putting all the government money in those banks instead of in the national bank. All right, so once again, this is another instance where Jackson's opponents are going to accuse him of acting like a king or a monarch. All right, and so the bank president, Nicholas Biddle, apparently didn't want to leave well enough alone. So then he made it harder for people to borrow money. Well, Jackson and Biddle's fight here is just going to be an absolute disaster for the American economy. So now Jackson is able to drive the bank out of business. So he got what he wanted, but his fight with the bank eventually hurt the economy. Now, luckily for Jackson, and unluckily for his successor, the person who's president after him, the economy doesn't actually collapse until a few months after Jackson leaves office. Which brings us to Martin Van Buren and the Panic of 1837. All right. Jackson's vice president, at least during his second term, remember his vice president in his first term was John Calhoun, who came up with the nullification doctrine and whose state was threatening to secede. And Jackson basically kind of threatened to hang anybody who talked about secession. So needless to say, John Calhoun was not going to be Jackson's vice president for the second term. So that went down to Martin Van Buren. And then Jackson was so popular that his vice president then went on to become president in 1836. But Soon after Van Buren took office, all of the effects of this fight with the bank took place, and a panic occurred. All right. A panic is widespread fear about the economy. Basically, all of this nonsense about taking money from the national bank, putting it in state banks, and then state banks had all this extra money that they started spending and using, and people got concerned that all these banks were going to start going out of business. So all at the same time, they rushed to the bank to pull out their money. And the problem is, banks don't always have everybody's money on hand at once. A bank, when it gets a deposit in from one person, they'll loan part of that out to another person. And the idea is that the second person will pay the loan back before the first person wants to take his money out. And typically, that system works fine. But every now and then, people will get scared and they'll all go to the bank at the same time, or more or less the same time, to take out their money. And this causes a panic. Because once one person realizes that a lot of other people are going to take their money out, then that first person thinks, oh, well, if they're taking their money out, I better go get mine before it's all gone. And this eventually causes everybody to try to take their money out at the same time. And it basically sends the bank out of business and causes the economy to collapse, which is more or less what happened in 1837. Again, just months after Jackson left office. So people started taking all their paper money to banks to exchange them for gold and silver, but the banks quickly ran out of the gold and silver. Okay. So, today it doesn't make sense because all of our money is pretty much in paper. But back then, the paper money was usually the equivalent of some sort of amount of metal, either gold or silver, and you could basically exchange them back and forth. A lot of times people would still use paper money because it's easier to put a few dollar bills in your pocket than a bunch of chunks of gold and silver. But what happened is when everybody took their money, paper money, to try to exchange it for gold and silver, well, the gold and silver runs out, and then people think that the paper money, since there's no more gold and silver to exchange it with, that paper money kind of starts to become much less valuable. So this panic of 1837 led to a depression. Right? That's a severe economic slump. And this caused widespread unemployment. Nearly 90% of the factories in the East went out of business. And so what happens whenever the economy goes downhill, people blame the president. But they always end up blaming the president who's in office when the economy collapses. They usually don't worry about the president who, put forth the policies that caused the economy to collapse. So Martin Van Buren gets the blame, even though a lot of these policies were put in place under Jackson. Now, to be fair, Martin Van Buren didn't really do anything or at least nothing effective that helped the economy. I mean, this panic occurred, a few months into his presidency. He still had, 3.5 years to try to make things better, and he really didn't take any sort of successful action that helped the economy. All right, so Van Buren loses his bid for re-election to William Henry Harrison, who becomes the first Whig candidate to run for office. I mean, not to run for office, to win the presidency. All right, William Henry Harrison becomes the first Whig president in 1840. And we're going to leave off there this development of free enterprise. We're going to do that in a different series of lectures here pretty soon. So we're going to end the Age of Jackson lessons